Okay, well, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Ben Batten. I'm the Managing Director for Volt, which is a global staffing company. I'm responsible for the Europe and Asia markets, and I'm originally from Australia, if you can spot the accent. Been living in the UK for the last 3 years. Prior to that, I spent 13 years living in Asia, so quite an interesting background in terms of diversity and inclusion. I'm joined today by a very credible panel, Winnie Annan-Forson, who's the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for Barclays across the UK, Europe and the Middle East, Annika Allen, who's the Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion for All3Media, and Paul Deemer, who's the Head of Diversity and Inclusion for NHS employers. So welcome to all of you. And perhaps I might just allow you to provide a brief introduction on yourselves as well. Winnie, would you like to go first?
Yes, I'm more than happy to go first. First of all, thank you all so much for hosting us today and also for taking the time to attend the session. As mentioned, I'm a Vice President within the financial service industry, specifically at Barclays, looking after DE&I across UK, Europe and Middle East. I'm hugely passionate about this agenda, mostly from a lived experience. So I'm a Ghanaian immigrant to the UK, and I always say I've lived in both parts of the world for equal parts of my life. And being of mixed ethnicity myself, being a woman, being a mother, as a working parent, navigating different complexities that come with all of those facets of identity, I'm really passionate about creating inclusive spaces for people from underrepresented groups and continuing to amplify the dialogue around what inclusion means, not just from my own lived experience, but across all intersectional facets of identity. And I'm excited to talk more about that today.
Thanks very much, Winnie. Annika.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Annika Allen, and I'm the Head of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at All3Media. So yeah, my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'm working in the media at the moment, but actually Winnie, I worked with her in the financial services on the Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion team there. But I started off my career as a journalist and migrated into TV production. And whilst working on TV, I was working on reality entertainment series from like 10 years younger to Richard and Judy. Some of you may remember that, some of you may not. Essentially, I hit that frozen middle where I just found it really, really hard to move up the ladder within the industry. And so I kind of really got disillusioned, left the industry, decided to use my kind of communication skills elsewhere, and worked as a freelance and consulting in kind of the communication and DEI space, kind of getting young people that wanted to work within the creative and media industries into those spaces. And I guess because of my experience, I'm really passionate about that side of things, because I know the stumbling blocks I experienced on my journey. And so having left the finance industry and coming back into kind of media and creative, it's like I'm home now and I know the challenges that I experienced. And so I'm really passionate about kind of helping others to realize their potential and putting the right process systems in place so that others don't have those same barriers. So I'm excited to be here and talk about DE&I today.
Thank you, Annika. And Paul.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. And again, thank you for inviting us along to this. And it's good to meet everybody. So my name is Paul Deemer. I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at NHS Employers. NHS Employers works within the health and social care sector, working primarily with the NHS, or National Health Service, in the UK, which is the 5th biggest employer in the world. We employ 1.4 million staff across all our different pieces, but it's not a homogenous group. It's made up of around 500 different organisations. They've all got their own cultures and different ways of doing things. So our challenge is trying to find a common ground, really, often for all subjects, but particularly around diversity, equality and inclusion. And our role at NHS Employers is to just help employers to understand what their duties and responsibilities are. And in that respect, I'm here as the public sector representative, I think, in comparison to Winnie and Annika. We have different duties, as people will know, in terms of public sector bodies. So it's to help them understand what their duties are and then to help them to achieve that as well. We do a lot of that through sharing good practice and case studies and that type of thing. So it's great to be here.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. So today we're talking about empowering inclusion, and it was headed workplaces of the future, but I think that could probably be better described as the here and now, because the future sort of come very, very quickly. We will have some opportunity for questions at the end, so please use the chat function if you'd like to put those in, and we'll look to try and include them if we have time. So the first question we want to look at is how big of an impact can the right technology, such as virtual reality, metaverse, Paul raised earlier about artificial intelligence and similar tools play in inclusion and growth. And Annika, I might put that to you to start things off.
Yes, that is an interesting question. I work in an industry where, we're telling stories and people often watching TV to learn about the world. And so I'm really interested in kind of where technology is going in this space. And I've seen many companies kind of using these immersive learning solutions for their businesses to kind of, I guess, just leveraging VR to kind of change people's perspectives, behaviors, mindsets, etc. And I think it's really interesting in the training space. I heard of one company where they're developing a virtual reality experience called In My Shoes, where participants will wear VR headsets and they can become a digital version of someone of a particular kind of demographic group. And so can you imagine kind of what utilizing VR to see yourself in somebody else's shoes? Because that will allow you to see how the world treats them differently. A colleague, it's Black History Month at the moment, and a colleague was telling me, I said, oh, what challenges have you experienced because of your ethnicity? And he was telling me how he was just running for a bus and the police happened to be nearby and thought for some reason he was running from them. So imagine being able to kind of look at through VR headsets and understanding that person's experience of the world. So I think definitely VR will be used for training, kind of in racial awareness, kind of open up broader discussions around kind of like empathy, and could help to like influence some unconscious bias in the workplace. But I do want to emphasize that a diverse range of people do need to be making these products and services as well, but I'm sure Paul or Winnie will have something more to add to this.
Yeah. Winnie, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I love where you've ended there, Annika, on the importance of bringing diverse perspectives and intersectional perspectives on creating this technology. And I think, in the DE&I industry, there's been so much dialogue around whether or not there's still a place for unconscious bias training. And I think bias still sits, unfortunately, at the core of a lot of issues around leadership and the way we engage with people from different underrepresented groups, for example. So being able to break down some of these biases by enhancing the narrative around lived experience, getting people to walk in each other's shoes, I think is a massive opportunity in this space. I think there's also a dialogue around AI, for example, and the room that it's creating for less biased talent pipeline design. And I know a lot of organizations have looked at things like blind recruiting to try and bring in more diverse pipelines, but there are new technologies now that are creating the opportunity for organizations to be able to essentially access a greater pool of talent by maybe removing identity from the process, right? And making it easier for colleagues with certain skill sets to match to projects or activities that will help grow their skill set through the use of AI. Now, I think a bit like Annika mentioned, there is still a danger there around humans designing these interventions, and that human bias can still be translated into these technologies. So how do we make sure that these are being designed with diversity and inclusion and also equity, right? The breakdown of those systems in mind, rather than being designed from specific demographics that might influence the way that these systems are created and have the opposite effect.
Paul, you had some interesting thoughts on the role of AI in this. Would you like to share some of those?
Yeah. I think Annika and Winnie have outlined some of the positive things that can come from using AI in a better way. And I don't disagree with them at all. I suppose the thing I think about is the risks associated with that. And I think, as Winnie was saying, it's a fine balance, isn't it? You've got to walk between creating something that's effective and not, but in that process by depersonalizing it as well, because people will know as well as we do that you know, we're living in a world now where people actually want a much more individualized process for many things, and that includes recruitment. And unfortunately, I mean, for ourselves at the NHS, we're very guilty of this, in the sense of, because of the volume at which we recruit. You know, and at the moment, just to give you an example, at the moment, the NHS across all those 1.4 million, it actually has 100,000 vacancies. You know, so you can imagine the volume at which we're recruiting across the NHS, and we've got a whole website which is called NHS Jobs, which is one of the biggest, as you can imagine, in Europe. It's a machine. It's a sausage machine. You know, it pulls people in, it churns people out. You know, and it's not a particularly good experience or a nice experience to go through. And I think we've got to think about that, about how useful that is. It's useful on, I think, on one level, particularly when you're doing, you know, volume recruitment. But equally, you know, there is a danger that it just becomes a process. And actually, you know, how do you build in things that, you know, Winnie and Annika are talking about, in terms of how do you build in, one of the conversations we're having at the moment, how do you build in lived experience? How do you evaluate lived experience in the recruitment process before the interview? Because, you know, we need to sift some of this stuff. We need to filter this down a little bit. So it's a great thing on a face value, but I think equally we need to just think through a little bit more and be a bit, and take it slowly, I think, and a bit more careful about how we jump into this.
Yeah, and recruitment's obviously my world, day in, day out. But I think even if before you get to the technology piece, if you think about the screening, you know, to your bit about the lived experiences, the screening questions, and in a lot of cases, hiring managers or the ultimate decision maker is the person that's crafting that. And, you know, do the biases, you know, do the questions actually, you know, filter people out, you know, before they even get the point to have that in-person conversation. So I think that's, you know, that's key. You almost got to start right back at the beginning and challenge the questions, challenge the filtering, the screening at that early stage. Winnie, I know you touched on the diversity tracking piece, but anything you could share about your experience in how you do that, and I guess also if there's any learns that you've had around positive or negative outcomes as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, in the context of kind of diversity tracking and conversation around measurement, a lot of people say the phrase, what gets measured gets done. And I find that very fascinating, especially in the context of banking, where we talk a lot to our business about numbers, right? And financials, that's the language that a lot of our leaders understand. And I think data has been a really strong catalyst for increasing the dialogue around the business case for DE&I, and also contextualizing the problems that we're actually trying to solve in this space. At Barclays, we recently started a campaign called Count Me In, where we're essentially going out to colleagues and asking them to share with us how they identify. And that's colleagues not just who are entering the organization, but also colleagues who have been in the organization for a while. And at one point, I think it was something like, there was no point after you joined that you could change that. So if you made a mistake at any point on your onboarding form, for example, we had no way of being able to go back to colleagues and ask them to review that information. So if you think about the fact that maybe someone may have had a long-term health condition or would now have a disability, maybe 10 years into their tenure with the organization, there is no way for us to now identify that aside from a conversation with their manager, for example, if they choose to disclose it, let's say if it's a hidden disability. So there are a lot of problems there that we were trying to solve. And I think Count Me In has been a great opportunity for us to go to colleagues and build trust around how this data will be used, what it tells us, and how it enables us to solve problems. So that's one thing. And I think referencing the word trust here is important. I know that in the industry, we talk a lot around not asking colleagues to disclose how they identify, because that word disclose in itself comes with quite a negative connotation, right? It's like report to us, you know, and it sounds negative, but actually sharing, collaborating, we want to work with you to identify opportunities. And I think that in itself is so important. But the other caveat I want to add, however, is jurisdictional lenses and how that plays a role. So, for example, in the UK, we have some legal parameters and guidelines around protected characteristics, right? And how we can ask colleagues about how they identify. So making sure that we have a really strong dialogue as a collaboration between DE&I, legal, HR around what is the art of the possible? How do we communicate it effectively? And how do we do it in the right way that doesn't compromise us? How do we hold that data? How do we protect that data and use it in the right way? And one example could be, we don't utilize data samples less than 10 for each protected characteristic to protect colleague identity, right? And that's one mitigating factor that we've put in place to support the trust element, right, that comes with asking colleagues for their data. In certain jurisdictions in Europe, you actually can't ask at all what protected characteristics are. In some other jurisdictions, it's actually unsafe because legally, the environment doesn't support people of specific identity, right? So as a global organization, we have a strong no discrimination or no racism, for example, stance, no bullying, no harassment stance. But we're also very mindful that we are engaging in certain jurisdictions where the view of the country may differ. So I think there are a lot of complexities, but I think that trust piece is important, protecting that colleague data, but also making sure that you're using it for only the use that you ask colleagues for it for, and being careful around that. So I think there are a few things to think about there.
Thank you for that. Paul, is diversity tracking prevalent within your organisation?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, we track across all the protected characteristics. Although interestingly, we haven't got a channel at the moment for tracking around gender reassignment, because we're having a real challenge in terms of going back to one of Winnie's points about, you know, what language do we use in terms of, you know, describing gender reassignment, trans status, etc. So that's something that we need to work through. But I think the trust thing is really important. Actually, it's a really important point, and it's really important in that whole process, because particularly with existing staff, because, you know, if you're going to give personal information to your employer, you've got to trust your employer to do that, and that starts with your manager. You know, we all know that people leave managers, not organizations. And so you've got to create managers who are, sorry, not create managers, you've got to recruit and employ managers who are going to create an atmosphere and an environment where people feel safe, they feel trusted to be able to give that information to you. So yeah, no, it's a huge challenge for us, and we've got huge gaps in our data because people aren't prepared to disclose. So for example, we have across those 1.4 million staff that we've got, for example, there is a centralized database for all of this information. And in terms of the sexual orientation field, for example, we've got a 50%, about half of those staff don't wish to declare for various reasons, for the very reasons, some of the reasons that Winnie described, you know, in terms of, you know, not feeling safe. Not legality, because obviously in the UK, you know, legally it's not a challenge, but yeah, 50% non-disclosure rate is quite worrying, really.
Yeah, it certainly is. Annika, you know, thinking about that trust element, because I guess that there's the conversation about when somebody first has contact with an organisation. Have you seen or implemented anything yourself where, you know, at the point that roles are being advertised or the first interactions with the organisation, that may have helped to alleviate some of those concerns, or, you know, promoted some of the internal work you're doing to ease those conversations or those disclosures?
So with the TV industry, there's the kind of workforce where we have, you know, where we'll have the usual onboarding and people can fill in their kind of diversity data. However, the other thing that we have with the TV industry is a system that's called Diamond. So Diamond is the industry monitoring system that's required by the broadcasters from the BBC, ITV, etc., for all productions to fill in the kind of, you know, what does the makeup of their production look like, who is working behind the camera, who is in front of the camera. And so the issue that we've had with Diamond is people actually again, wanting to disclose on that, and people saying, oh, I don't want to be a tick box, or not understanding the reason for them to fill in the diversity data. And also the frustrating thing for many of the production companies is that we don't actually see the final data. To understand kind of like who's filled it in, what does that data say, what does the industry look like, until they release their final report. So then that's another reason why people sometimes can't be bothered to actually fill in the data behind that. So actually Monday just gone, I actually sent the head of creative diversity from the BBC down to the set of Call the Midwife. And so he went to the set, spoke directly to all the cast, to all the crew, and said, this is what Diamond is. This is why we wanted to fill it in. This is the need for it in the industry, so that we can understand what the makeup of the industry looks like, where we need to be putting our efforts to kind of drive change within the industry, and just really encouraging them to fill it in. And he spoke to people one-on-one, spoke to people in small groups, spoke to the cast directly, and many of the cast were like, actually, I've never ever even heard of this, I've never even seen an email about it. And actually it turns out the majority of them, the communication about it was going to their agents, and their agents it's not making their agents any money, so they were just deleting it and not sending it on. So all of them were like, just send it to us directly and we'll fill it in. We want the industry to be more diverse and more inclusive. We want you to have this information. So we're happy to be involved. Actually, and even having a conversation with a few more colleagues about that, they were like, actually, we want to do the same thing on our set. And so one of the things I'm going to consider making is a bit of an inclusion playbook about kind of Diamond and diversity data and why it's important. So all the production companies that we own, because we own about 45, can then take that and showcase it to the cast and crew in order to kind of really try and amplify the message as to kind of why it's important for us to get hold of this data, because ultimately we know that having a diverse industry will help for have better creators, better storytellers, and have more authentic representation on TV, which is what we want. So I think there's some of the issues that I'm having when it comes to kind of the data piece.
Yeah. And it's such I guess there's such a important public education element to that as well, that, as you say, the representation piece, the acceptance piece, and I guess challenging or influencing social norms in that way. Now, when we think of each of your roles, I didn't get the opportunity to have a look to see, but DE&I leadership roles are still relatively new. There's a lot of organisations that that don't have these roles. I'm interested to hear from you about what you feel that the impact is in your organisations, and I guess from a peer group, maybe the positive impact you've seen within the workplace. But equally, there's still so much more to be done. This is still really early stage in, I guess, workforce roles. I think if we were to look at sort of the number of jobs advertised 5 years back compared to today, it's probably, I guess the multiplier is probably a 30x or something of that nature. But Winnie, could you perhaps share what you've seen in your journey in this capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the role of the Chief Diversity Officer, the head of DEI, DEI manager, DEI leader has absolutely evolved over time. For some organizations, there is newness on that maturity curve around the role that the DEI lead plays. And I think the one challenge I like to put out when I'm speaking to leaders in this industry, Barclays has had a head of diversity for more than the 11 years I've been here. So we've actually been a lot longer. We've had a full team that whole time. So we've had a very strong maturity model in this space. And I think where I see a big opportunity is DEI going from being a doer to being an enabler. I think sometimes the temptation when an organization brings someone in as a DEI leadership person or bringing a team in is for them to drive inclusion, which typically companies will fund small teams relative to the rest of the organization to do this activity. And it's absolutely impossible for such a small team to deliver that. If anything, I think how DEI can be strategic in enabling the business to take ownership is where maturity will evolve from being an aware organization to being an organization where inclusion is ingrained. And for us, some examples of where we've tried to make that shift, I'm not at all implying that we've fully made that shift, but where we're trying to is one, we just relaunched our DEI strategy in June this year. And a big part of that is talking about our 5 priorities. 2 of those are around leadership, leadership accountability, and then that data-led piece around strategic ownership. We are enabling leaders with more and more data around inclusion for their businesses, their inclusion index scores, the makeup of their organization based on our protected characteristics. And like I said, that's always in samples of 10 or above, but we're enabling them with more data now to see the trends. But another thing is we introduced a diversity and inclusion objective, and there's one for leaders, one for managers, and then one for individual contributors. So every single colleague, as part of their performance review, needs to talk now about how they are driving inclusion in their team, in their sphere of influence, and as a leader. And that could be anything from joining employee resource groups as an ally. So not just joining groups that you identify with, but actually joining ones for ones you don't have lived experience on, to learn more about the experience and how you can drive inclusion. It's things like visible inclusion, for example. So how are you role modeling as a leader? How are you talking about inclusion in your town halls? How are you making sure that you sponsor and support diverse talent in your teams and be visible in doing so, so that others can do the same? And I think the final point that we've tried to encourage is also, as part of allyship, we launched a Power of Allies toolkit, I think it was last year or the year before. It's visibly challenging some of the things that cause bias and discrimination in the system, and not letting that happen behind closed doors, but being very open about how we challenge that. And I think, like I said before, we are still on a curve with that, and I recognize that we are more mature in this space than more organizations. I think in summary, the biggest shift I see is how DEI can enable leaders to take on this accountability versus taking and owning that accountability for themselves.
Okay, Paul, I guess the NHS is probably one of the best examples, given the size of your workforce in diversity and inclusion. But what have you seen over the last couple of years? Have you seen any sort of significant shift through your role, your engagement with leadership, hiring managers, and what the outcomes of that have been?
Yeah. I mean, I think Winnie's set that out very nicely in terms of what the challenges are, and she's absolutely right. For me, this is about leadership in its broadest sense. Yeah, whether you're talking about specific roles or whatever, essentially it's about leadership. And what we are trying and have been trying to develop within the NHS is what people might call authentic leaders. And we also use the term of compassionate leadership as well within the NHS. And obviously some of that is particular and peculiar to the sector we work in. We need leaders who understand the challenges of health and healthcare. So they need to have that compassion within them. But authenticity is a different thing. And you have to nurture that, and you have to grow that. And we've spent a lot of time focusing on that, because we know the organisations within the NHS that have made significant strides in this area are those that have got a chief executive and a board who are prepared to lead on this. I had a conversation this morning with a chief executive of an NHS trust. It was quite a candid conversation, and he finished off today by saying, sometimes as a chief executive, people think you've got all the power, and he said it's absolutely not true. He said you haven't. He said, but what you can do is, as a chief executive, he said, is you can decide where you're going to focus your attention, and he said that will make difference, and that's what we want chief executives and leaders to do. And so I think that piece is really, really important. Just quickly on the enablement piece as well, again, Winnie's absolutely right. This is about organisations enabling a diverse thinking, if you like, to grow across their organisation. And the thing I've seen, and you've probably seen it yourselves in your own organisations, particularly over the lockdown and the pandemic, was a huge growth in networks. I mean, we call them networks, you call them employee resource groups, I know in the private sector, we call them networks. And the significance of that for me is because I mean, we've seen a huge growth in all sorts of networks. And the significance for me is that by creating a network, if you give it the right authority and the right power to act, then you are disseminating some of that power down to them to make a difference. And I think that's really, really important. So, but it does depend on a little bit of money as well. The most effective networks are those that are funded by the organisation. But leadership, enablement, I think, are both really important processes. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Anne, thank you for there was a few questions there, but one that I want to pick up on, I might put this to you, Annika, first. There's two elements to the question. So how are you educating and managing your recruiters and hiring managers to understand DE&I? And we put that as we can't compartmentalize that as, you know, DE&I, what does that actually mean and why do we do it? But not just why do we do it, but the value to the organisation. And that sort of is an extension of what Paul was saying. You know, you really do need that key stakeholder engagement and ownership of it, because it's not sort of it's not the tick box. You know, we need to do this because we don't have enough women or whatever the sort of metric might be. But this is important to our organisation to create diversity of thought, to promote and challenge innovation in the organisation, to create, you know, all the reasons why it needs to be done. But you know, what have you seen, drawing from your experience, on what's worked well, or what initiatives have you driven and what have you learned from that?
For recruiters?
Yeah, and I guess promoting DE&I, you know, as why it's valuable. I guess, you know, thinking about sort of broadcast, we need to be representative of the audience for those roles. It might be a little bit different. Maybe you draw on your Barclays experience.
Yeah, because I've literally been in my current role 3 months, so it's still very new at All3Media, and I guess the differences with All3Media is that the creative industry is so far behind when it comes to DE&I. So it's I feel like I'm starting from scratch. Like, we don't have kind of networks or employee resource groups. Everything is it is about kind of like getting people to kind of understand what DE&I is and things. You know, sometimes people just think it's about one thing, particularly because of the last couple of years where I guess race and ethnicity has been at the forefront. And I keep on saying to people, there's a bit of an illusion of inclusion at the moment, that actually there's a lot being done to drive change, which there is, but I think people think the dial's been moved more than it actually has. And actually, going back to Winnie's point about measuring things, actually, if people looked at the data, they would see when it comes to the various dimensions of difference, things haven't moved. And in TV, I mentioned Diamond, our monitoring system, and actually the fifth cut of the Diamond report showed that actually, despite all the initiatives that have been happening in the industry, things actually haven't moved for any of the groups besides sexual orientation, in terms of people from the LGBT plus community. That's kind of generally stayed the same at a good level within the industry, behind the screens and off screen, on screen. But outside of that, the dial hasn't moved with anything else. So I'm going to have a lot of work to do when it comes to kind of the recruitment, in terms of helping people to kind of recruit talent, to retain that talent, and how we're enabling talent to rise within the industry, because they're, I guess, my 3 priorities with my current role. If I think back to kind of like Barclays and previous roles with recruiters, I think it's just that education on some of their processes and things when it comes to interviews. Actually, what are the questions you're asking? Ensuring that they're asking the candidates the same questions to make sure that the process is fair for all. So when you're interviewing, who are the interviewers? Have you got a diverse interview panel? Actually consider the different levels of those interviews, and maybe even going out of the department, so that actually there's not that bias in place. So you're thinking, oh, I'm going to work with this person. Do I like this person's personality? Or if you're thinking, oh, actually, I like this person, I can go for a drink with them, so I want to hire them, rather than focusing on actually, do they have the skills to do the job? And so I think it's about thinking about all the things that have been put in place to kind of mitigate bias out the process when it comes to recruitment. And even before that, speaking with the the recruitment teams in terms of where they're placing their adverts, where they're going to as many spaces and places that and communities as possible outside of the usual places they would go to look for hires. And so just kind of diversifying where we place those adverts is one of the areas as well that we've been keen to kind of really move the dial on within the organisation. So there's lots happening. I said Winnie's still at Barclays, so she could probably tell you a bit more, but that's some of the things I know that I've kind of actively worked with recruiters in the past.
Yeah, and Winnie, before I ask you a question, one of the things that we've seen with clients in conversations, it's not sort of the looking at the candidate side so much in the diversity, it's also the diversity of the people that those candidates are interacting with. So if it's if you're trying to attract that diverse talent, the process also needs to be representative of the type of people that you're attracting, rather than people thinking, well, this is I'm only interacting with males, or I'm only interacting with people of color, and it's we're representative of the workforce that to attract, and not people opt out because they don't feel that they're going to be welcome or included in the organisation. The education piece, Winnie, so that's existing teams, but also leaders as they join the organisation, and having them have that understanding and belief and understanding the values of where a diverse and inclusive workforce exists within the organisation. Do you have any sort of specific strategies around how you educate and continue to sort of upskill your hiring managers within Barclays?
Yeah, absolutely. So all hiring managers typically have guidance that they're given, which includes DE&I guidance. Like I mentioned, things like our mandatory objective also includes guidance around what that looks like from a hiring standpoint. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is what that guidance looks like versus what people put in practice, because often what we find is that a lot of the biases and issues that exist are not necessarily due to a lack of knowledge, but more of a lack of understanding, and also lack of, I guess, grasping what it looks like in practice. So I think there's still a massive education piece there. When we talked about technologies, for example, that would bring that to light. We are looking internally around AI and how that can influence more diversity in our candidate slates, creating pools of talent, for example, that we can tap into. And that's something that we're actively trying to do now. I think for me, I'd like to see more of a shift in ownership of that education from the guidance from the organization, and managers and leaders taking ownership of what that looks like, not just from kind of the lens of gender or ethnicity, which we're now starting to see a more of a shift of a dialogue with, but equally intersectionally across all fronts. And I think that's where there's a big opportunity for us. I've talked about kind of line manager, hiring manager guidance that we have, the objective. We also do things like statements that we utilize right at the beginning of our hiring processes. So things like flexible working statements are part of all of our adverts. We also raise the diversity and inclusion point to all our candidates very early on in the process. And typically even some of our candidate assessments and the scenario-based assessments that we've had also include elements of inclusion when candidates are looking at that. So it is ingrained. I just think I'd love to see more of a shift between how the organization is steering that and how much ownership is taken, I think, at an individual level. So that is still a journey, and I think most organizations would resonate with that.
Okay, also not to forget, Winnie, the kind of reasonable adjustments as well. So adding that, adding the reasonable adjustment statement to adverts as well, to ensure if people need anything before they come in for an interview and things. And one of the things I'm working on at the moment is creating an inclusion passport that colleagues will basically be able to take around all the different production companies within the group with them. So when they fill in their when they start the company and fill in their form, they get asked, do you want to fill in this inclusion passport? And it's not just about kind of like disability as well. It's about actually, do you need time to pray? And, are you pregnant? Do you need time out to go to doctor's appointments? It's just inclusion overall. And so that's one of the things I'm working on.
Yeah, so which leads in nicely to sort of the hybrid remote working and greater flexibility, how we can monitor inclusion. But I think Annika, you just raised something quite interesting around what inclusion actually means, and it does mean different things to different people, whether you're, whether you're a working mother, whether you're pregnant. But I think the breaking down some of those, some stereotypes as well, and who does the pickups and drop-offs from school, and do we accommodate late starts? And I think one of the things that I've seen certainly greater prevalence of, and hearing a lot more from clients, is that people still want to come into the office, but they're really prioritising those pickups and drop-offs, and whether that's the mum or the dad. And it might be, well, we do a half day in the office now, we go and pick up our child, but then we come back, we come back to work, but we're at home in the afternoon. I really like what you shared around, some of the advertising and flexible work policies at the point of advertising, which is a great takeaway for me. So, Paul, would you like to talk about this? I think it'd be interesting in your space, because I think the whole sort of healthcare world has changed markedly with, even if you think of remote doctor appointments and, remote assessment, all that sort of stuff. But anything that you've seen in terms of monitoring inclusion or in your world?
Yeah, I mean, how long have you got? We could do a whole conference on this, couldn't we?
Yeah.
I think the important thing here is to remember that all of this has happened very quickly. I keep reminding people that I don't know if you remember this. We didn't talk about this before, but just before the lockdown, I think there were so many elections and changes and government scandals, weren't there, before that? But I think it was the time when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party. And I think it was in the run-up to the election, just in end of 2019, I think it was. And in his campaign, his manifesto, he put forward the idea of a 4-day working week. And he got completely lambasted for that. If people just, you're absolutely, in a different world, move forward, 2-3 years, and we're comfortably talking about hybrid working like we've done it all our lives. We haven't. This is a very, very new thing. We've been accelerated into this world where we're talking to each other in boxes and we almost think it's normal, and it's still very, very new. But actually, again, if you think about it as well, we're calling it hybrid working, but we used to call it work-life balance. Yeah, Ben, you were talking about, taking picking your son up or your children up, going to the school plays and school athletics days and stuff like that. That was work-life balance. Yeah, we used to call it. And actually, the challenges of that are just the same with hybrid working. It's again the thing I talked about earlier about the risks. On one level, on face value, hybrid working is absolutely fantastic for lots and lots of people, but there's huge risks involved in it. You could end up spending 12-15 hours working at home, with whether it's your laptop on your knee while you're watching Gogglebox or what other programs Annika and her colleagues are putting on. Call the midwife, or sitting at the dinner table with your mobile phone next to your bed at bedtime. It's all those challenges of work-life balance that we had before. They haven't changed, they're still the same. So the responsibility for employers are twofold. Firstly, we've got to give people the opportunity for flexible working. And in the NHS last September, we introduced, because we have some national terms and conditions of service for all NHS staff. And last year we introduced the right from day one to request flexible working. The minute you walk into a job, you can ask for flexible working for every job, any job. Yeah, it's not always going to be agreed. It's not always going to be approved, because obviously, if it's a frontline job, you've got those sorts of considerations. But the right is there for people to do that. We're trying to encourage people to do that for all sorts of reasons, not least of which is related to well-being, because we know now there's a huge link between the way people work and how well they are as well. So there's that big connection, which is for employers. So it's about making the opportunities for people to do that. But then the responsibility for the employer is also, going back to my thing about work-life balance, making sure that they use that properly, yeah, and that they look after themselves in the way that they work. So I'm a big fan, Ben, of flexible working, hybrid working, but again, you know, it's just got to be balanced out really for people.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Annika, you know, the question was about monitoring inclusion, but I want to take it a little bit further. And I like to call it, you know, do people feel safe to talk around the water cooler? But you know, there's a lot of stuff. As Paul said, this has all happened so quickly. But when we think about you know, a lot of interaction between colleagues happens remotely now, or it's more ad hoc rather than consistent. I think that there's the monitoring inclusion, if we, you know, look at different categories, if you like, of how we're creating that. But you know, I think that there's also that education piece as well, as an awareness of you know, how and why we're accommodating or including you know, people, whether that's somebody works in the north and the office might be in the south of England, you know, accommodating you know, in office and then school pickups and then working in an evening. You know, what are you seeing in that regard? Have you seen any sort of best practice, or have anything else to share?
I think generally most people, if their organization allows, depending on the style of work you do, just want the flexibility and to be able to take care of their own diary. So if you have, I don't know, 8.5 hour working day, why can't you start at 8 and finish at another time instead of being 9 to 5? I think people just want that overall flexibility. And I think this transition of kind of like hybrid or remote work is presenting kind of like a fresh opportunity for us to kind of continue to challenge the way things have been done and to think about new ways that we can drive positive change in this area. But also it's important that whatever approach we have to hybrid or remote working considers kind of the broader aspirations when it comes to kind of DE&I. We have to actively observe, we have to measure, we have to track data and sentiment of the workforce and to understand the impacts of DE&I in this space as well. And always continuously kind of adapt an approach if needed in this space, because as Paul said, it's still so new. We're still trying to kind of understand kind of what works within the organization. It's like within my current company, many people hybrid work, but some people with their jobs have to be in the office, you know, every day. And so you have to also consider, you know, how is this impacting them? How can we make sure that they're having a good experience within the workplace, since they're seeing everybody else being able to do 2 or 3 days in the office, but they're having to be there 5 days a week. So I think monitoring the colleague experience, trying to understand the sentiments around that. And then encouraging people to, if you are office-based, to come into the office for those moments that matter, and to be able to connect, I think, is important as well, because yes, there are companies that have gone fully remote, but I think that people do need that kind of human connection and interaction and things. So I think it's about looking at, as organizations, how are we navigating that, and just being as inclusive as possible in every way. So like with team meetings and things, I remember when we first went into lockdown and we're all virtual and things, I'd be like, oh, I don't want to have my camera on, and then my camera was off. And then I remember a colleague was like, actually everybody, I need you to have the camera on, because remember, I've got a hearing impairment, and sometimes it just helps if I can read your lips. And as soon as she said that, I was like, how? Like, it was light bulb. It shouldn't have been a light bulb, but it was. It's like, yes, I completely understand. Let's make sure that we're kind of being inclusive and turning cameras on in team meetings and things. And even down to so many people are onboarded during the pandemic and lockdown and didn't get that kind of employee experience. And so you didn't even have the kind of chance to, I don't know, introduce yourself properly. This is my name. And names are very important things. You know, I'm Annika, but often people call me Annika. I think it's because of Annika Rice. And actually, my company are making a program called Annika as well. So that doesn't help, because lots of people at work at the moment still are saying Annika. I'm like Annika. So it's just a very small but important thing. You know, a name is often central to a person's identity and is a central element of human connection and belonging. So just making that effort to really kind of understand someone's name and you know, just, I think is just really important. So if you're on a virtual call and you hear someone pronouncing someone's name wrong, then you can be an ally and say, actually, either say person's name is pronounced this way, or just keep on saying the person, like Annika. So I think there's definitely lots in that kind of hybrid, remote, flexible working space that will need to be discussed, and lots of companies, including mine, have working groups of people in different parts of the business that are coming together to discuss this, so we can understand what is the best way forward, what works for the majority in the space. And I think that's what you need to do, is take it to the people. Don't just make all the decisions from the top. Actually let people from different parts of the businesses come together to see what the future ways of working can be.
Indeed, and I appreciate you're still very new where you are, but I suspect some of the script writers and things are also thinking about a lot of this. How do they incorporate that new reality into their scripts? And as I said, there is that sort of social responsibility element to inform and influence. We're coming up. Time has gone very quickly, but I guess that sort of leads on to the last question. What does the future hold? And we've touched a little bit on technology earlier on, and with AI. But Winnie, what are you seeing, and are you seeing any sort of great innovations in terms of challenging traditional approaches that may help organisations to fast track in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I do that, I'll quickly do a 30-second on the hybrid working piece, because I just wanted to add that I think the conversation around hybrid working is too focused sometimes on the colleague experience. I think there's something around, Paul, I love that you talked about risk, but there's business risk in not getting this right. More so than ever, real estate, the cost of living, the cost of, where businesses are situated is getting expensive, right? So companies are having to think about their footprint and what that looks like, and maybe moving to lower cost locations to get the best out of their presence and their team and their real estate and their costs. So actually, I think there's something around looking at it in conjunction with leadership capability and the cost of not getting that right, but also psychological safety and the culture that enables that in the right way. There's a lot of research that says, I loved Annika's story about the colleague with the hearing impairment, but there's also something around racial discrimination, microaggressions, and colleague safety not to come into the office. Things like reasonable adjustments. My home is set up for me as a person with physical disabilities to work better and more efficiently and be more productive. So I just wanted to add those nuances in that are important. In terms of what the future holds, I think back to that point around the maturity curve and leader-led responsibility on this. I think tech plays a big role, like we started right at the beginning. But unless leaders, humans, don't learn to be more capable around being inclusive, supporting each other, creating and holding space for inclusive dialogue, we're really going to struggle. And I think it's pivoting from that DEI owns this, HR owns this, to leaders own this. We drive the culture, and I think that's where the future is.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I know this is a subject close to your heart, but what does it look like for you, and what keeps you awake at night thinking about what the future holds?
I think it's the thing I talked about earlier. So it's about not forgetting that at the end of the day, and again, Winnie's touched on it. HR is a human process. Yeah, we're called human resources for a reason. Yeah, we're meant to be that connection between the business and the employees. So we mustn't forget that in all of these processes. And that other thing that Winnie talked about is so important, that psychological contract. And again, I think don't forget, in the last 2 years, there's been a huge shift of balance in that psychological contract as well. I think it's been completely blown out of the water, and there's a whole new relationship now between employer and employee. And I just think, I always talk about this from a HR professional point of view. I've been a lifelong member of the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development. And I do think it's important that we just remind ourselves that, at the end of the day, that psychological contract is really, really important. And we've got to make sure that we devise processes and mechanisms for these things in a way that makes it not depersonalized, but makes it human.
Yeah, I think that human piece is important, and again, on sort of that education piece, I think that it's some of the leaders that I've engaged with, there is that fear of we're going to get something wrong, we're going to offend somebody along the way, and I think it is okay to make mistakes. I think there's always sort of that fear there's going to be a knee jerk, I'm going to upset somebody from what I'm going to do, and there is that sort of, I guess, to get it right, there needs to be the acceptance that sometimes things don't go to plan, and somebody's going to say something they shouldn't, and it's then again having a comfortable, safe work environment where people can say, well, look, actually you've addressed this incorrectly. This is the correct path, because a lot of it is still quite new within organisations. Winnie, sorry, not Winnie, Annika, do you think companies are doing enough to be able to educate not just the leaders that are sort of involved in hiring and managing people, but the teams themselves around these diverse issues?
I think companies are, they're trying. I think the intent there, the conversations and their intentions are there. It's now time for action. And I've seen when companies have a commitment to kind of breaking barriers, opening those difficult conversations, it enables kind of better self-care practice and relationship building in the workplace. Going, I guess, back to the original question that you asked in terms of where is DEI going in the future, I think for me, it's kind of thinking about well-being, because I think well-being is been at the forefront in the last few years. And I think many organizations I've worked in, they'll either, if they do have well-being, then they might have one person dealing with it, might have a small team, and usually it's separate to DE&I. And I think what we're going to start seeing more and more is kind of those intersections of well-being and DEI, and having that a bit more integrated. Talking about the human aspect, and a company's greatest asset is its people, and looking after their well-being is crucial. So I think that's where kind of the future is going for me, and that will help. And if leaders are concerned about the well-being of their employees, I think that will only make a better workforce. And so yeah, that are my thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and feeling safe to be their authentic selves. We'll certainly get the best out of people. Winnie, 30 seconds and sort of closing remarks from you.
Just to say thank you all so much for the richness of dialogue. It's been great hearing all of your perspectives, and I think just that piece around ownership is the key takeaway for me here, around how can we all do our bit to take action, like Annika referenced, and then from Paul's side, manage the risks associated with not getting it right. So thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much, Winnie. Paul, your closing remarks?
No, not particularly. I think we said a lot, and hopefully it made some sense to people. And if people want to carry on conversation, check me out on LinkedIn. If you want to connect, or Twitter as well, I'm quite active on there. So happy to talk to people about this stuff anytime.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Annika?
Same as Paul, really. I think we went for a lot during this conversation. So if you do want to connect with me on LinkedIn, add me at Annika Allen. I often write about lots of kind of DEI topics on the channel.
Okay. Well, look, I'm really grateful for the three of you giving up your time, and also those of you that have joined us to learn the insights. I hope that you've been able to get some tangible takeaways and perhaps challenge your current thinking and other ideas, and really that's what this is about, is creating forums like this to be able to think differently about what you can do in your organization to really make a difference. So with that, bid you a good afternoon, and catch you next time. Bye, everyone.